The first sign that the fight was unwinnable was not the gunfire but the silence that came before it. Even the insects seemed to pause, as if the jungle itself had leaned back to watch what was about to happen. The platoon was stretched along a narrow rise above a sluggish creek, boots sliding on wet roots, jerseys dark with sweat, eyes scanning a wall of green that never stopped looking the same. There had been a briefing at first light, a couple of grid references on a creased map. A simple mission spoken like a promise. Push into a suspected staging area. Confirm movement, withdraw before the afternoon storms. In Vietnam, simple was usually the first lie you heard that day. Staff Sergeant Nate Callahan walked in the middle of the column, not up front where the first mistake got paid for, and not in the back where the last man learned too late that he was last. He kept his head low and his thoughts quieter than his breathing. On his shoulder hung a rifle the other men had joked about since he'd showed up with it. A beat-up M1 carbine with worn bluing and a sling that looked like it had lived through 3 wars. Useless, one of the squad leaders had said the first time he saw it, half laughing. Toy gun. Callahan hadn't argued. He just adjusted the sling and kept moving. He liked the carbine for reasons that didn't sound impressive in a tent. It was light, it didn't snag as much in brush, and he could carry it all day without feeling like his arms were being dragged down by the humidity. Mostly, though, he liked that he knew it. He'd learned a long time ago that in a place like this, familiarity mattered more than reputation. The ambush began with a flat crack on the left that could have been a branch snapping if he hadn't been followed by 2 more from the right. Then the deeper hammering rhythm of an enemy machine gun finding its lane. Men dropped as if the ground had been pulled away from under them. The creek bank erupted in little puffs of water where rounds hit. Someone shouted contact, and another voice yelled down, like anybody needed the reminder. Callahan went prone in the mud and felt it soak through his uniform instantly, cold against skin that had been hot a second before. The jungle swallowed sound in odd ways, turning a firefight into a series of disjointed noises, the clack of bolts, the snap of rounds through leaves, the hiss of men breathing too hard. Lieutenant Parker, young and trying to keep his voice steady, shouted for a base of fire and a pullback off the trail. But there was no clean pullback. The enemy had chosen the ground, and the ground was doing what it was supposed to do: keep Americans exposed, keep them bunched, force them to move in the open if they wanted out. Callahan lifted his head just enough to see the line of fire slicing the rise. He didn't see the enemy. They were never the ones you saw first. He saw effects: leaves exploding, bark splintering, a man's helmet rolling loose like it had decided to abandon him. The platoon's lead squad tried to push forward to break contact and got pinned harder, the machine gun stitching just above the dirt, owning the space where movement used to exist. A radio operator crawled toward a tree to get a better signal and froze when a round cracked close enough to make him flinch like he'd been slapped. Callahan reached out and pulled the kid back by his harness. "Stay low," he hissed, voice tight but controlled. The kid's eyes were huge and glassy. He nodded without really nodding. A medic specialist, Monroe, moved on his elbows toward a wounded man and worked with hands that shook less than they should have. Callahan's mind did what it always did under pressure. It started sorting chaos into shapes. The machine gun was up and right, slightly elevated. Rifle fire was spread wider, creating the sense of being surrounded even if they weren't yet. That was the point of a good ambush. Make the trapped men imagine the ring is already closed, so they waste time and ammo fighting phantoms. Lieutenant Parker tried the radio again and got static, the kind that made you want to throw the handset into the creek. Callahan saw Parker's jaw clench, saw the brief panic he tried to hide, and understood something in a simple, brutal way. Leadership out here wasn't always about rank. It was about who could see the next 10 seconds clearly enough to buy the 10 after that. "Guns got us," Callahan said to Sergeant Vickers beside him, keeping his voice low. Vickers looked at him like he was stating the sky was wet. "Then we need to shut it up," Vickers muttered. "How?" Callahan didn't answer right away. He watched the brush line where the gun's rhythm came from. Bursts, pause, bursts. He waded through 2, then saw a flicker of movement, a shape shifting behind a fallen log, the brief gleam of a barrel. It wasn't much. It was enough. "I'm going high left," Callahan said. Vickers stared. "High?" Callahan nodded once. "We keep shooting from here. We die here." It wasn't a heroic statement. It was a calculation. Vickers started to protest, then stopped when another burst snapped low and forced both of them into the mud again. Callahan's carbine felt almost weightless compared to the thicker rifles around him. He checked his magazine by feel, kept it seated, and signaled to 2 men he trusted: Corporal Dwyer, who stayed calm in ugly moments, and Private Rios, who was young but listened. They crawled toward the left where the ground rose. The jungle there was thicker, the kind of undergrowth that grabbed sleeves. But the elevation offered what the kill zone had stolen: Angles. Callahan moved inches at a time, keeping his body pressed into wet earth, letting the brush hide him the way it hid the enemy. Somewhere behind them, someone screamed a name, and the scream got cut off, not by death necessarily, but by discipline. Men learned quickly not to waste noise. The climb burned his arms. Sweat mixed with mud until he couldn't tell what was what. He reached a root cluster and paused, listening. The machine gun still hammered. It sounded confident. That confidence was a weakness. Callahan edged forward and found a narrow gap through leaves where he could see the log, the gun's position, and the assistant shifting to feed another strip. The distance wasn't far, but in the jungle far was measured in what you could see, not in yards. Callahan didn't aim like a man trying to be a legend. He aimed like a man trying to end one specific problem. When the assistant leaned out, Callahan fired. The man dropped back out of sight. The gun stuttered, then resumed, but slower, less smooth. Callahan adjusted his position by a foot, just enough to change the angle, and waited for the gunner to expose more. Another shot. The rhythm broke again. Dwyer, beside him, fired once with his own rifle, and the machine gun went silent for a heartbeat that felt too big to be real. Down in the kill zone, that silence opened a window. Men who had been trapped began to move, dragging wounded, lifting heads for the first time in minutes. The enemy rifle fire surged, trying to fill the gap the machine gun had left, but it wasn't the same. The ambush had lost its spine. Callahan's carbine kicked lightly, quick and manageable. He fired when he saw a movement that looked like command rather than panic, then shifted his body, never staying still long enough to be solved. The enemy started to probe high, sending rounds into the brush above the platoon, searching for the reason their plan was coming apart. Leaves shredded. Dirt puffed off roots. Rios whispered, "They're looking for us." Callahan didn't deny it. "Let them look," he said. "As long as they look here, they're not killing them." He keyed his own radio, low power, and pushed out the simplest message he could. "Parker, machine gun disrupted. Move now. Don't wait." Static swallowed half the words, then Parker's strained voice came back, clipped and urgent. "Copy. We're moving." Another burst snapped close, and Callahan felt bark splinters sting his cheek. He blinked mud out of his eyes and kept the carbine up. This was the part the stories never captured. Not a man charging, not a speech. Just the stubborn act of staying in a place you were not supposed to survive long enough for others to leave it. The platoon began to peel away from the kill zone in short, desperate bounds, men covering each other with controlled bursts. Monroe the medic nearly crawling backward as he kept pressure on a wound. Callahan saw one of his own stumble and go down, not dead, just hit, and watched two others grab him without hesitation. That's what made the ambush the wrong kind of trap for Americans. It assumed fear would atomize them. It didn't. It made them cling together tighter. Callahan shifted his aim again, saw a figure sprinting low toward the machine gun log to revive it, and fired twice. The figure collapsed and didn't get up. The enemy fire faltered, then flared, angry now, less disciplined. In the space of a few minutes, the platoon went from pinned to moving, and moving meant living. But the jungle still had its hand on their throats. Callahan knew the fight wasn't over just because the kill zone was breaking. In Vietnam, the second part of an ambush was often the part that finished you. Pursuit, flanking fire, a final squeeze on men who thought they'd escaped. He looked down the slope and saw his platoon slipping back into thicker cover, and he realized something else, something colder. To the enemy, he was now the problem. The useless rifle, the toy gun, was the reason their perfect trap was failing, and the jungle was about to turn its full attention toward the man holding it. Callahan didn't remember deciding to stay behind, not in a dramatic way. It was more like his body understood the obligation before his mind put words to it. When the platoon withdrew to a tighter perimeter and denser vegetation, Lieutenant Parker's instinct was to pull everyone in, count heads, and get a clean report up the chain. In a classroom, that was leadership. Out here, counting heads too soon could get you all killed. The enemy didn't simply disappear because you moved 50 yards. They followed the sound of your breathing. Callahan slid down off the high pocket and met Parker behind a line of broad leaves where the lieutenant crouched over the radio with Vickers. Parker looked up, eyes bloodshot with adrenaline. "We lost the point squad," he said, voice tense. "Some went right, some went—" he swallowed. "We can't hear them." Callahan stared at the tree line like he could see through it. "They're not lost yet," he said. Vickers gave him a look that carried both hope and suspicion. "You sure?" Callahan didn't answer with certainty. He answered with the truth he had. "If they're alive, they'll be trying to move, but the enemy will sweep the flanks. We need to get out before dark, or this becomes a ring." Parker tried the handset again. Static. He looked like a man losing control of a spinning wheel. Hire's not answering, he said. I can't raise company. I can't, Callahan cut in. Not to insult him, but to anchor him. Then we solve what we can solve, he said. We get the wounded moving, we pick a direction. We don't sit still. Parker nodded, grateful for anything that sounded like a plan. The platoon began to move in short pushes, dragging men who couldn't walk, keeping weapons outward. The jungle closed again, swallowing the last evidence of the kill zone. A hard rain started as if on cue, a monsoon sheet that drowned sound and made every footstep a slip, lightning flashed, turning faces into brief, pale masks. And then the enemy hit again from a different angle, exactly as Callahan had feared. Rifle fire snapped from behind and to the right, higher ground again, forcing men to drop into mud and keep their heads down. They're trying to cut us off, Dwyer shouted. Callahan crawled to the edge of their small perimeter and saw movement through the rain, shadows weaving between trunks. Not a full battalion. Enough to keep them pinned until night fell, enough to let another element swing around and close the exit. The battle had changed shape. It wasn't a single ambush now. It was a slow tightening, the kind that ended with Americans found at dawn with empty magazines and silence in their throats. Parker's voice rose. We need air. He shouted into the handset as if yelling could fix radio propagation. We need... A burst snapped close and forced him down. Callahan took the handset from Parker's hand, not as a power move, but because the lieutenant's fingers were shaking too hard to keep it steady. Callahan adjusted the antenna, moved 2 feet, tried again. A faint voice came through, distant and broken. Not company. Some higher frequency relay, maybe a bird somewhere. Say again. Unreadable. Callahan kept his voice flat. Platoon in contact, pinned, multiple wounded, requesting immediate support. Grid approximate. He gave the best he could. We are danger close. The word tasted like metal. It meant you were asking for fire near your own. It meant you were admitting you might not have another option. The reply was a smear of static and then, stand by. Stand by was not help. Stand by was the universe telling you it had other priorities. The rain hammered harder. The enemy fire pressed closer in little surges. Monroe, the medic, hissed at a man to stop trying to sit up. The man's eyes were wide and he kept whispering, "Where's Thompson? Where's Thompson?" As if saying the name could pull the missing back out of the trees. That's when Callahan realized the point squad wasn't just missing. They were out there alone, cut off, and the enemy knew it. If the platoon didn't move, they would all be swallowed together. If they moved too fast, they would leave the separated men to be taken one by one. Parker looked at Callahan, eyes pleading for an answer that didn't exist. Callahan felt the carbine against his chest, light and familiar, and he made another decision that would sound insane later. I'm going back, he said. Vickers grabbed his sleeve. No, he snapped. That's suicide. Callahan shook his head once. Not far, he said. Just enough to find them and pull them into our track. Parker's mouth opened to order him not to. But Parker hesitated, and that hesitation told Callahan everything. The lieutenant knew he couldn't spare the men, and he also knew what it meant to leave Americans out there. 5 minutes, Parker said finally, voice cracking on the edges. If you don't come back, he didn't finish. Callahan didn't need him to. He signaled Dwyer to come because 2 was still small enough to move quietly. Rio started to rise, but Callahan pushed him down. You stay with the wounded, he said. That's an order. Then Callahan and Dwyer slipped into the rain, moving low, using the noise of the storm as cover. The jungle felt colder now, not in temperature, but in intention. They moved by memory, by the direction the kill zone had been, by the faintest echoes of distant firing. Twice they froze as shadowy figures moved in the brush. Once Callahan saw the outline of a man with a conical hat shape, and decided not to fire because sound would summon more. The carbine stayed shouldered, ready but disciplined. They found the first of the separated squad the way you usually found them in Vietnam. By stumbling over a boot you shouldn't have seen. By hearing a whispered curse. By catching the glint of a wet metal buckle. Private Henson was pressed into a depression, breathing ragged. When Callahan touched his shoulder, Henson flinched like he'd been struck. Then he recognized the uniform and grabbed Callahan's sleeve with a desperate grip. They're everywhere, Henson whispered. We can't get out. Callahan leaned close. How many? He asked. Henson shook his head. Feels like all of them. Callahan knew that feeling. Where's your squad leader? Henson pointed with a shaking hand. They crawled another few yards and found 2 more men, one with a bleeding scalp cut, the other dragging a leg that didn't want to function. Their squad leader, Sergeant Madsen, was there too. Jaw clenched, eyes hard. We're boxed, Madsen said. They're sweeping. Callahan nodded once. Then, we don't fight the sweep, he said. We slip under it. Madsen looked at the carbine. Even now, under rain and fear, his expression flickered with doubt. Callahan didn't defend his weapon, just spoke the only promise he could make honestly. Follow me, he said. Stay low, stay quiet, and if you can move, you move. In the middle of Vietnam, surrounded by green and static and the smell of wet earth. 5 men who should not have been alive began to crawl in a line behind the man with the useless rifle. Because in that moment, usefulness wasn't a label. It was a result. They moved like ghosts that didn't believe in their own invisibility. The rain helped, washing away footprints and drowning small sounds, but it also made everything harder, turning slopes into slides and tree roots into traps. Callahan led them at a pace that felt painfully slow, but speed was noise, and noise was death. He kept checking behind them, not with big head turns, but with the smallest shifts of angle. Reading movement in the leaves, listening for the wrong pattern of steps. Dwyer stayed near the back, watching the rear, guiding the wounded man by the strap of his vest whenever the man sagged. Madsen crawled close enough to whisper, "You got a plan?" Callahan didn't pretend. "I got a direction," he said, "and I got one window. The sweep will go past, then they'll tighten. We need to be gone before they decide where we are. Ahead." The jungle opened into an old bombed-out clearing, not empty, but lower, with shattered trunks and tall grass. It was the kind of place you hated to cross because being seen there meant being measured. But it was also a landmark. If Callahan could reach it, he could orient toward the platoon's movement path. The problem was getting across it without drawing fire. Callahan stopped at the edge and listened. Somewhere on the far side, a faint cough. Another cough answered. Enemy. Close enough to smell them if the wind shifted. Callahan's carbine felt like a tool built for this moment, light enough to hold steady even while his arms trembled from exhaustion, quick enough to bring up and down without catching. He pointed to a shallow ditch cutting across the clearing. "We go ditch to ditch," he whispered. "No one stands. No one runs." The wounded man's eyes looked like tears might come, but he nodded. Callahan went first, sliding into the grass, keeping his body low, using elbows and knees. Halfway across a flare of light to the far right, someone had fired in another direction, maybe at the platoon. The enemy attention shifted for seconds. Callahan used those seconds. He reached the ditch, dropped in, and waved the others forward one at a time. Henson crawled like a man being pulled by a rope, terrified but moving. The wounded man dragged himself with a sound that made Callahan's stomach tighten. But the rain still hammered, and the ditch swallowed the noise. Madsen came last, face lit briefly by lightning, eyes staring hard as if he could force the jungle to behave. When all 5 were in, Callahan didn't let himself breathe easier. He knew relief was a luxury you paid for later. They continued, hugging the ditch until it narrowed into a muddy stream. Now they had direction, a line to follow. They crawled upstream because upstream meant higher ground, and higher ground meant better chance at radio and movement. Eventually the sound of gunfire grew ahead. American. Short, controlled bursts, the tone of men trying to preserve ammo. Callahan froze and held up a hand. Dwyer braced, carbine tight. Madsen leaned in. "That them?" he whispered. Callahan nodded. "Could be," he said. "Or could be someone else. In Vietnam, you never assumed the sound of your side meant safety. It only meant familiarity." He pushed forward to the edge of a small rise and saw the outline of Lieutenant Parker's perimeter. Men crouched behind trees, a couple of claymores set, Monroe working on a guy's arm, Parker hunched over the radio again. The sight hit Callahan harder than he expected. Not because it was comforting, but because it reminded him how small their world was out here, one platoon. One patch of jungle, one fragile line between living and erased. Callahan signaled. A sentry lifted his rifle, ready to shoot, then recognized him and hissed, "Jesus," in seconds. Hands reached out, pulling the separated men into cover. Parker's eyes fixed on Callahan like he was seeing something the jungle wasn't supposed to give back. "I thought," Parker began. Callahan cut him off quietly. Later he said, "We're not done." The enemy fire shifted again, pressing closer as if the jungle had noticed its meal was slipping away. Parker finally got through to someone higher up, voice urgent and raw. "We need illumination," he said. "We need gunship. We need static." Then a faint reply. Unable at this time. Parker slammed the handset into the mud, then immediately grabbed it again like it was the only lifeline left. Callahan crouched beside him. "Listen to me," he said, voice low, steady. "They want us here until night. If we stay, they tighten. We move now in the rain while they can't see." Parker stared, breathing hard. "Move where?" Callahan pointed with his chin. "Northwest, there's a ridgeline about a click. If we get there, we can see a clearing big enough for a Huey at first light." Parker swallowed. "And if we don't?" Callahan didn't soften it. Then we become the story people tell like a warning. Parker closed his eyes for half a second, then nodded. Okay, he said. Okay. The platoon began to move in the ugliest kind of order. Wounded first, then the strongest, then the rear guard. Callahan took the rear because the rear was where panic tried to bloom. The jungle behind them crackled with movement. Shots snapped. Men flinched but kept moving. Callahan fired only when he had to, conserving because the carbine's magazines were finite and the night was long. At one point the wounded man slipped and cried out, and the sound felt like it echoed for miles. Callahan grabbed him, hauled him forward, whispered, almost, even though almost was a lie. They reached the ridgeline near midnight, soaked and shaking, and collapsed into a shallow defensive arc among rocks and roots. Below them the jungle was a black sea. The enemy was still there, unseen, patient. Parker finally raised a relay again, his voice hoarse. "We are on high ground," he said. "We will mark at first light. We have multiple wounded. We are still in contact." The response came faint but clearer now. "Copy. Stand by." This time, stand by sounded different. It sounded like the world had finally noticed they were still alive. In the dark, Callahan sat with his carbine across his knees. Mud caked into every seam of his uniform and thought about how close the platoon had come to vanishing without anyone ever seeing the details. If you have family who served and came home quiet, you know that feeling exists in the gaps. This is the part where I'll ask you something simple. If someone in your family ever served, or if you've heard a story that was only told once and never again, leave a comment with what you know. Even if it's just a name and a place, because these stories don't survive on official reports alone. They survive because people refuse to let them disappear. Callahan watched the tree line and waited for dawn, because dawn was when they would either be rescued or finished. And the useless rifle was still the only thing that felt predictable in a world that hadn't been predictable for days. Dawn in the jungle didn't arrive like a sunrise. It seeped in slowly, turning black into dark gray, then into a dim green that made shapes visible but kept intentions hidden. The rain eased into a wet mist that hung in the air like breath you couldn't exhale. Men around Callahan looked hollowed out, eyes red-rimmed. Hands stained with mud and whatever blood they'd touched. Not in dramatic pools, but in smears that meant someone had been hurt and still moved anyway. Lieutenant Parker crawled to the lip of the ridge with the radio and tried again, voice barely above a whisper. "We can mark," he said. "We can mark now." The reply came quicker this time, a tight professional tone. "Copy, mark, and pop smoke, aircraft inbound." The sentence landed like a weight suddenly removed from their chests. But relief was dangerous. The enemy understood daylight too. As the sky brightened, fire cracked up from below, probing, trying to pin heads down before the extraction could happen. Callahan shifted into position behind a rock outcrop, where he could see the slope descending toward the only clearing big enough for a helicopter to touch. Tall grass moved in irregular waves. Some of it was wind. Some of it was not. Parker pulled a smoke grenade, looked at Callahan for confirmation like he needed permission to hope. Callahan nodded once. "On my count," he said. Parker waited. A distant thump, thump, thump began to build, so faint at first it could have been imagination, then real enough to feel in the bones. The Huey came in low, rotors biting humid air, and the sound changed the jungle instantly. Birds exploded out of trees, leaves whipped, the enemy fire spiked in panic as if they were trying to shoot the sky itself. Parker tossed the smoke. Colored haze poured upward through branches, unnatural and obvious, a sign that said, "Here, here, we're still here." The helicopter banked toward it, then flared, hovering just above the clearing. A crew chief leaned out, arm windmilling, mouth open in a shout nobody could hear over rotor wash. The platoon began to move the wounded first, dragging and half-carrying them down the slope. That slope became the new kill zone, and Callahan knew it. Every man moving downhill was a silhouette against lighter air. The enemy fired from below, from sides, from wherever they'd crawled overnight. Callahan used the carbine the way he always had. Quick, controlled, choosing targets that mattered for seconds. He wasn't counting bodies. He was counting threats. A muzzle flash from a banana tree. Cluster, a figure rising too confidently. A weapon swinging toward the wounded. He fired, shifted, fired again, and kept his breathing steady because panic was contagious and his job was to be the opposite of contagion. Dwyer and Madsen worked the wounded down the slope while Monroe stayed on them like a shadow, refusing to let bandages slip. The first wounded man reached the clearing and got hauled into the Huey. The helicopter rocked under the weight and rotor wash flattened the grass into a temporary floor. Then enemy fire hit closer, snapping past the skids, and the pilot lifted a foot, hovered higher, forced to keep moving or risk being pinned on the ground. "Faster!" Parker shouted, voice raw. Men scrambled, slipped, got yanked up by sleeves and straps. Henson fell, then got lifted by two others without a word. The helicopter's crew chief pointed at Callahan's ridge position, signaling frantically for covering fire. Callahan offered it with a calm that didn't match the danger. He saw a machine gun team trying to set up behind a termite mound, and he fired until the movement stopped and the weapons sagged. The lines below wavered, then surged again. And Callahan realized the enemy was doing what they always did when they sensed a kill. They were risking bodies to stop the last few Americans from reaching the bird. That was the battle's final shape, the one no one walked away from on paper, a wounded platoon racing a tightening ring. One aircraft hovering on borrowed seconds, jungle choosing who it kept. Callahan shifted position along the rocks, keeping his profile low, and saw Parker dragging another wounded man toward the clearing. Parker was an officer, but right then he looked like a kid hauling a friend out of a river. A figure surged out of brush near Parker, too close, too sudden. Callahan's carbine came up almost without thought. He fired once. The figure folded. Parker didn't even turn to look. He just kept dragging, jaw clenched, moving like his body had become a machine built for only one purpose. The Huey dipped again, ready to leave, and the crew chief screamed something and pointed toward the slope. Callahan counted quickly. Most were down, a handful still on the ridge. If the helicopter left now, those men would be stranded on the high ground with an enemy that had daylight and anger. Callahan keyed his radio, voice tight. "Hold," he said. "Hold for 30. Parker below looked up like he'd heard it in his bones. The pilot hovered, skids twitching. 30 seconds in a firefight was a lifetime. Callahan fired at shapes that moved like intent. Then he moved, never staying in one spot long enough to be solved. A round cracked off the rock near his head and threw grit into his face. His ears rang. He blinked hard, forced focus, and kept the carbine up. The last men began to slide down the slope, half running, half falling. Dwyer grabbed one by the collar and shoved him toward the clearing as if pushing him into the future. The enemy fire surged again, and for a moment it felt like the jungle was reclaiming its debt. Callahan stood just enough to get a clear lane and fired at the nearest muzzle flash. The carbine's lighter recoil kept the sight picture stable, letting him work fast. Not like a marksman in a clean range, but like a man keeping a doorway open while people escape a burning building. Finally, Parker reached the clearing with the last man at his side, and the crew chief hauled them up. Callahan's plan had one final requirement. He had to leave too. He slid down the last stretch of slope, boots skidding in wet grass, body heavy with fatigue and the delayed shock of surviving. The helicopter hovered, rotor wash slamming him like wind off an oncoming truck. Callahan reached the skid, grabbed the frame, and felt hands clamp onto his sleeves, pulling with urgency. As he climbed in, enemy rounds snapped through the grass behind him, close enough to make the sound of tearing cloth. The Huey lifted hard, banking away from the clearing, and the jungle dropped beneath them like a lid closing. Inside the aircraft, men didn't cheer. Some stared at the floor, shaking. Some held on to the wounded like they were afraid letting go would undo everything. Monroe slumped against a bulkhead, hands still poised as if he might need to work again any second. Lieutenant Parker looked at Callahan with a kind of disbelief that wasn't gratitude yet. "Not fully. They said we weren't supposed to make it," Parker finally said, voice hoarse. Callahan didn't answer with pride. He looked out at the endless green rolling under the Huey and spoke with the blunt honesty of a man who knew how close the edge had been. "They were right," he said. "We just didn't listen." Back at base, the debrief was a blur of dry maps and rewritten timelines. Men trying to turn chaos into something a headquarters could file. Someone asked Callahan about the carbine, half joking, half serious, like the weapon itself had violated a rule. "That thing saved you," a captain said. Callahan shrugged. It ended because an exhausted platoon kept choosing movement over surrender, discipline over panic, and because one leader refused to let a label like useless decide what was possible while men were still breathing. Years later, if you asked the survivors what they remembered most, they wouldn't start with the smoke or the helicopter or even the gunfight. They'd start with the moment the machine gun went silent in the first ambush and the realization hit them like cold water. The trap had a flaw and they were going to exploit it, not because they were fearless, but because fear didn't get a vote anymore. And if there's any legacy worth carrying from a morning like that, it's not a myth about invincibility. It's the reminder that the stories that sound impossible usually aren't built from miracles. They're built from small choices made under pressure, choices that didn't feel heroic at the time, only necessary. In Vietnam, countless men made those choices and never had their names attached to anything larger than a memory someone carried quietly for decades. If this story stirred up a name or a place in your own family, write it down somewhere, say it out loud, share it if you can, because the jungle doesn't have to be the thing that takes them in the end. Forgetting can do that all by itself.